Welcome. Welcome to semifinals. So the motion reads, well, the Infoslide reads, BookScan is a data provider for the book publishing industry, whereby book publishers check the profitability of an author based on the sales history and popularity of their previous works. BookScan numbers are like an author's credit rating. This house supports BookScan. Here. I invite the Prime Minister to begin the semifinals for the house.
I'm audible, loud and clear.
Yes, you are. You're very loud and clear.
Okay, so let me give me 10 seconds to set my timer first. My timer starts 3, 2, 1 now. Firstly, let's take a look into what the status quo in the book industry has been. We think that actually lots of in the book industry, lots of books that actually have high quality actually they don't have the possibility to being promoted, as we think that the always happening situation is that the people who are in the position of power, for example, if I'm the daughter or I'm the son of a famous writer, it's more likely for my book to be promoted because my father or my mother is actually at a higher position of those book community or such kind of thing, which means that actually, even if they don't have high quality, even if they're not that famous with those authors, it's really likely for them to get lots of the advertisement, promotion, or even being recommended to primary school students or such kind of things. And this means that actually the audience or the readers, they are forced to see the book that they are not that interested in. In that situation, both the readers and the authors, they don't have a clear evaluation standard about the book. For example, some professional books about the laws and so on, actually they don't know how to select the book. They feel really confused and so on. We think that the setup here is that we think that the publisher's incentive A. We think that in many instances, the historical check record of the author is not available, which means that there are too many authors in many topics or statistics that are not available for them. And even if not, the publisher are not a specialist in every possible areas that allow them to examine the quality of every type of book. And thirdly, they already published very little or new or nameless authors in both worlds. And fourth, we think that actually the competition in this book industry is already really highly competitive. And we think that our stance of goal today is that we want less privileged author has more possibility to being recommended, and they will focus more on the popularity of the book, the quality of the book, rather than whether the author has much more resources or in the book industry. And come to the first argument today, we think actually these we can provide a more clear mechanism for readers to choose the book that they really want. We think the wide credit base is a good thing. We think that it actually saves the readers time. The readers don't have time to read all the books and to distinguish which is the most suitable for them. We think that the why this is principally justified to set up these standards. Firstly, we think that it's actually based on the author's own efforts before, which means that they actually do a lot of research. They read a lot of books so that they can write the books that can catch the mass public's attention or can gain favors. So we think that actually it's principally just for us to give them some better promotion as they spend a lot of efforts in the past. And also we think that this motivation mechanism can help. They deserve it. And we think that for readers, especially for those who, for example, prepare for exams and need some professional books, we think that why the convenience we bring to the reader are so important, because they have more time reading the books that are suitable for them rather than spend lots of time selecting the book. It will make them have more interest to buy this book, read this book, and so on. And I think that I may argue that famous authors, they won't have the incentive to continue to write good books, but I think it's not true, because if the books they write this time fails, they will the publisher will not continue to give them promotion later. So we think that actually they still have this kind of incentive. And we think that this evaluation standard is better, because what is rational is actual, and what's actual is rational. I think the comparison here is compared to those standards set by some several professionals, we think that the public recognition or the public favor is much more fairer. And come to the second argument to explain why this is really important. We think that the less monopoly exists in the book industry and less curious authors actually get more opportunity. We think that the evaluation center here would be whether the book can gain its like audience or whether the book is of high quality. We think that they don't need to waste their time, also don't need to waste their time building connections with like so-called famous people in the book committee or to with the publisher or to ask for opportunities. They can focus more on writing high quality book and so on. We think that also the second impact here is more minority author can write their books. We think that for example, there are two kinds of situation. Firstly, the Black people write the Black stories and the white author write the right story. We think that actually, even if, for example, in the Nobel Prize, we think that those kind of discrimination also exists. The books from Asia, from India, is less likely to get awarded or get promoted or get their books being published compared to those right author and so on. But actually, those books still have lots of local readers, still have lots of popularity within their country. So isn't it under these standards, really more likely for those story about the Black writing by those Black authors being promoted rather than always those specialists or so-called professionals have some bias on those Black authors and always try to publish the books of those right authors and so on. So we think that the comparative here is, we think even we think actually in both sides, even if in their side, without this kind of credit rating system, those authors that are not famous, they also won't get any chance to get their books being promoted and so on. They have no way to solve this problem. We think that the BookScan is a good thing as long as you have your own reader groups or as long as you have local readers, it's really likely for you to get promoted and you won't like so influenced by the like the interpersonal connection or so-called those kind of relationship with famous authors and so on. And thirdly, the third argument is for small writers, actually it's more likely for them to create or produce more creative artwork. Why is that? Actually, we already have lots of famous authors in the markets. So consider that this market is already like highly competitive. The small authors, when they try to prevent themselves from suffering from the homogenization, actually they won't like try to produce books that are quite similar to the famous writers and so on. Actually, if they want to compete against or win those kind of famous writers, there are two ways for them to choose. Firstly, writing higher quality book, and secondly, more importantly, they will write the book in a more creative or innovative way to catch people's attention. For example, writing different types of books, for example, scientific fictions and so on. And I think this both of these two options will be really good for both authors and also the readers. And I think also those writers won't blindly follow the chain or the popularity, but because they all know that if they blindly follow the chain, actually it's harder for them to compete against those famous people. So that it's really likely for them to seek another way or seek another channel or seek another way for them to make themselves more creative and so on. And we think worst case, and even if they are being kicked out of the market, we think it's still good, as if you can't have your audience, you can't earn money. We can give you a suggestion that this is not a good career way for you to go. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Prime Minister. We now invite the Leader of Opposition.
I'll take 30 seconds to change my notes. All right, POIs verbally, I prefer one from closing government. If not, opening government is welcome. Let me just set up my timer. All right, starting my speech in 3, 2, and 1. First, what does this technology look like? OG left out a bit blank. Understand this technology essentially tracks sales and your performance. So it not only tracks, for example, how many books were bought from different from which bookstores. It also tracks things like how many people talked about your book online and online forums and that sort of stuff. It basically tracks your book and the performance of your book on a very holistic level on many different platforms. Right. Notice the comparative. Comparative is now sort of task. Instead of relying on this numerical technical metric, what you rely on is the quality of the book itself. So publishers, specific individuals who are in charge of publishing are going to read through manuscripts, and they themselves are going to personally decide if this book is worth it. That's a comparative, and that is in the status quo that they have to deal with on the side of the house. Before we move on to substantives, however, a couple of bits of crucial framing in this round. First, this debate is not about big shot authors with a million connections, because notice that in either side of the debate, people like J.K. Rowling, people like R.R. Martin are going to sell books regardless, because these people have so much connection and so much clout that these people are simply going to get all the publishing deals regardless of this motion being passed. This debate, therefore, is only comparative for authors that maybe had a few books published, but are probably not hotshot authors with a million connections. This takes the OG's framing out insofar as we don't think nepotism is a part of this debate. Second bit of framing, understand that publishing houses in both sides of the house, in both of this debate, want to earn money. So profit probably won't be happy earning $1 million less in either side of the motion, which means that they're likely to sell the same number of books. So books are going to be sold equally on both sides, which means that the amount of profits that authors get are also going to be same on both sides of the house. So this debate is about what type of books are being sold and to whom the profit and what type of authors receive the profit in the very first place. We think that is what the issues of this debate are and what is comparative in this round. 3 things in my speech. First, I'm going to talk about what is better for authors. Second, I'll talk about why you get better quality books in outside of the house. But thirdly, I'll talk about how you get better why this is better for like minority authors and that sort of directly engagement OG's example as well. First point, why it's better for the author. The premise of this argument is that publishing houses are going to place a heavy prioritization on the numerical value that this author has and the social credit that this author has, rather than the individual value of their manuscript. Because understand what publishing houses and publishers prioritize is safety. They want to only invest in a book that is definitely going to be safely earn you some amount of money. Note what this is worse on their side of the house, because what they have in their side is a literal set in stone numerical metric. The reason why they're likely to prioritize it is because ultimately their bosses are going to be the ones who care a lot more about this numerical metric. They want to see what score you have out of 10, and the bosses and the corporate overlords of publishing houses like the Puffin and then that sort of stuff, they're gonna want to author which has a high high rating and that sort of stuff, right? Which is better in our sort of house, because what we do in our sort of house is we force publishers to qualitatively assess the sort of value of this book. The reason why this is better is because note that all these publishing houses and these publishers, these individuals who read the manuscripts, these people have a lot of experience. They're readers themselves. They probably know writing a lot. They can assess quality of a manuscript really well. The problem is in their sort of house, they're forced by their bosses to consider the numerical metric. In our sort of house, they have the ability to express their intuitions and actually judge if, okay, is this book going to be a bestseller? Is this a story that should be told? Instead of having to be forced to actually rely on a numerical metric and a number, which means in our sort of house, we allow the publishing individuals to give a chance to authors who actually wrote good scripts despite having a bad score, right? We think therefore, insofar as that is true, we think less authors get chances on their side of the house. But secondarily, we think that authors are more likely to fail, because now that the failures are clearly visible, if a book gets no buzz on the internet, if this book had exactly how many sales all across the world. The problem is now, given this is going to reduce your score, authors who have failures are likely to never get any chances, even if they have, for example, wrote good books before. One failure is likely to decrease their credit score a lot, which means that they don't get chances later, which means that the very career of writing books become significantly unsustainable. Insofar as that is true, we think things are significantly better in our side of the house, because authors don't have to constantly work to a number, but rather they can focus on actually writing good stories. We have more accessibility to the industry, but secondarily, you get better quality of books as well, because notice that now you don't have to incentivize basically getting scores, because notice that the best way to get scores is basically clickbaity stuff. You've seen this with YouTube, right? Because YouTube is literally the same system. They use an algorithm which tracks the number of engagement you get and that sort of stuff. The same thing is going to happen here. You're going to either go for generic content, or you're going to literally use clickbaity sort of book titles that attract people but don't have a lot of substance, which notice we crucially flip this flip the golf point as well, because PM sort of asserts that PM asserts that writers sort of research what sort of books are likely to succeed. Exactly, they're going to research and find that the books that are likely to give them a steady level of success is books that are clickbaity and unsubstantive. We think in our set of thoughts it's better because we allow publishers to actually, because the way that you get success is basically by writing the next big thing, by making a manuscript that's so good that the publishers have no other option but to give you the publishing and give you the money, because that is simply such a good story. You incentivize authors to write better stories in our set of thoughts because you stop taking risks and making good stories unprofitable. The benefits of this is clear because reading books is good for individuals, it's good for authors. We think generally better quality of books is better for society. But finally, let's talk about minority authors, because know that the people who are the most likely to be hurt by the system are individuals who don't fit into the white heteronormative order. This looks like Black authors, feminist authors writing books that explore more niche topics that are really crucial and need to be discussed in the status quo, right? Crucially note that even though there are certain mechanisms for giving minorities representation, there are offset by the fact that now you have a legitimate reason to turn minorities away, because previously it would be racism to turn a Black author away. Now you literally have a numerical system which can tell you that, look, bro, it's not me being racist. The reason why I'm rejecting as a Black author is because the numbers don't lie, which means that one, you disincentivize Black authors from writing in the very first place. You discourage women from writing because they feel like their books are never going to get sold, and publishing houses have a legitimate reason to turn them away. But secondarily, these authors who are particularly vulnerable, oftentimes these Black authors, these women sacrifice a lot. They sacrifice other ways to get a stable income in order to get into the business of writing books. So they are disproportionately harmed as a result of not getting opportunities in the market. But finally, note what the comparative is better in our set of thoughts, because in the comparative, we have things like Indie Awards, which can give some minority writers some opportunities and give them clout. You have things like more appreciation towards minority art. You're seeing social movements encouraging, giving more exposure to Black books written by Black authors. You're seeing the New York Times have a separate category on their website for books written by minorities and books written by women. Notice that these mechanisms are only allowed to actually work in our set of thoughts when you don't give publishing houses the legitimate metric in order to turn authors away. Notice that the people in charge on their set of houses, the corporate overlords, who actually have the ability to actually have a say in whether a book is good. Because previously these corporate people didn't have the time or the energy to read books, so they left it to the publishers and the people who read the manuscripts. In their set of houses, these people have too much control and they prevent minorities from actually being able to get their art across. In our set of the house, minority art is allowed to flourish, books get better, and authors survive. I am incredibly proud to oppose.
Thank you very much, Leader of Opposition, for that speech. And now invite the Deputy Prime Minister.
Hi. Am I audible? Audible and visible? Sorry. Hi. Hello. Can anybody hear me?
I can hear you.
Oh, okay. Yeah, sure. I just need some feedback. Yeah. So, okay. I'll take POIs specifically in the chat. I want to be very clear. I only take POIs in the chat. Do not open your microphone and verbally interrupt me. Okay. So my time starts in 3, 2, 1. Errol clearly misunderstood our framing when he chose to co-opt with our framing that majority popular authors are symmetric in this debate, which we agree, and provided more mechanisms about majority bias. What we are saying is that such majority bias exists in both worlds as symmetric, but at least BookScan is providing an effective change in the incentive structure of authors that leads them to evaluate more of the minority authors' books, and that leads to more diversity. I want to be very clear about the delta of this debate. I think books about culture and minority ethnic representation, such as depiction of indigenous cultures in African countries. First thing I would note here is that sci-fi books, popular wizard stories like Harry Potter, are always the most popular books that everyone wants to publish, right? But like my panel mentioned, it is highly saturated competition. The same logic applies to like super famous authors that panders to the majority bias. They're not being the tipping point in this debate because that also exists the same problem in their side of the house. Second thing to note is that rich white readers never read the books published like on minority ethnic representation, no matter who reads it, right? Even though it's written by a white professor, probably they won't be able to read it. And in the cases that they do read it, I think that it's probably because they don't discern among like the authors, and don't read into those, like they don't care much about the genuine representation of the African culture, of the minority culture at large, and that is why they choose to read the books like written by some people like to some white professors. Therefore, I would say on opposition, they cannot get such representation on the delta, which means when publishers utilize the data on our side, they will see the high quality books in these areas. OO says, oh, the final thing is like, oh, authors are forced by publishers to write on popular perspectives. First response is for authors who only cares about money. I would say that's symmetric because such majority bias also exists on their side of the house. But secondly, for many authors, I would say, who write about indigenous culture and minority culture, that care about representation more in their own niche readership group, which is also making them enough money to sustain themselves. They're not making, their incentive is just not making as much money as possible to be rich as J.K. Rowling, and that is exactly why they will still be willing to write about books that doesn't pander to majority preferences. The extension I will make here is that racial biases and like some majority biases exist even more when there's an absence of clear standard or tool to evaluate the popularity among its core leadership group. Why? One, we say that when a decision choosing among several similarly non-super famous authors is made by the publisher, what he or she think will be captured, more likely to be captured by like proximity bias, by risk-averse mindset. The biggest publishers in the world, I would say, are those that form is like from established institutions like Oxford, like Cambridge, like Routledge, right? When the nuanced data is not immediately accessible to them, the editors are captured by one, proximity bias, because they feel naturally closer and more trusting to people who share their same identity. But second is their risk-averse financially mindset. When the data is not available, the safest way to choose to publish the books of those white cisgender male authors' books that are less controversial, that are probably more likely to be accepted by more people. But thirdly, is that they seek advice from other established book writers. They use this mechanism to scan the books in the status quo, who just would recommend their privileged friends, which further entrench the cisgender and Eurocentric privilege within this circle. But comparatively, on our side, when the data is available, they do choose to publish minority books. For example, the books depicting African culture or gender minority experience, written not by white professors or cisgender authors doing fake and condescending empathy, but actually by those who are African Americans, African descendants, and true LGBT authors, even if they're less established. Why? One, I would say the reason behind this is the core readership of this type of book buy in the books written by the authors who share their identity, who can truly reflect their living experiences. They're willing to pay for the books, for the Black cultural books written by Black people, right? So the data of the minority authors actually look better than those Eurocentric misrepresentations. The second reason is that the other aforementioned biases just play less into the incentive structure of the publisher in our side, because now the publishers know and have a very visible metric in place. They know this type of book written by this Black author will sell better in this particular niche market, even though the white professor writing on the same topic is more privileged in general. Now, before I move on to talk about the impact and further into the delta, I will take a point from
You mentioned competition, right? You say this is a really competitive market, so That is precisely the problem, right? In a competitive market, what's more likely to actually work on your side is clickbaity titles that earn regular revenue.
Okay, sure.
Given it's competitive, you need to be
let
unique.
me tell you in this way. I think by this point you still don't understand our framing. The competition is symmetric. That means if sure, J.K. Rowling's book is a hot sell, it's a hit, right? It's the #1 sales book, but everybody wants to publish it. It's quite saturated, and also that same competition exists on your side of the house. Every mechanism that you give, like saying that why this is a problem, exists on your side of the house. We, by using BookScan, is creating a delta by changing the incentive structure of the publishers, those who can be changed. If you want to say some publisher only care about this competition, only want to publish J.K. Rowling's book, they will publish it anyway, right? Now, impact. I would say there are more representation of the high quality books telling genuine stories about certain culture. By culture, I mean not only African culture, but also culture of minority, ethnic, gender, and indigenous group. Because I would say in this world, there's no longer white professors' work of what African life flooding the market and leaving the authors having no choice but to read in Eurocentric views, because the readers probably generally doesn't discern among these books when the publishers disproportionately publish the white professor's book because of the biases that I mentioned before. This results the readers like having no choice but to read these books. Although I would say in the counterfactual world, when the BookScan is in place, that the core readership will choose more of those books written by people who are of their same identities. This is in the status quo, they really do not have that choice, and we are providing them choice. And then we avoid the resulting in stereotypes like, oh, African is a country. African is only about pandemic and poverty. We avoid such stereotypes and have a depiction of a more diverse content of how beautiful African continent is, and how the people in indigenous groups celebrate their cultures in this way that gives them more representation and gives and like crowds out those Eurocentric books by the non-Eurocentric genuine ones, creating a critical mass. We are very proud to propose.
Thank you very much, Deputy Prime Minister. We invite the Deputy Leader of the Equipment. Stay here.
Yeah, am I audible?
You're audible.
Okay, I'll take 20 seconds to set up my timer. Okay, my pronouns are she or they. I won't be checking the chat, so if you have any POIs, just unmute yourself and ask me. That'd be great. Okay, starting my speech. 3, 2, 1. I'll do very simple 3 things in my speech. I'll take down OG's case by their best, and then I'll be giving you the very important metrics through which this debate should judge, because it got pretty messy by this time. Lastly, I'll be reminding you why OO is the only house in this debate that fulfills these metrics. What do you get from OG essentially? Prime Minister comes up and tells you that low quality books will be, Prime Minister comes up and tells you that, look, this is their side of the world is a lot less time consuming process because readers can now really choose the book that they want. Now they don't have to read every single book. Okay, look, this is very symmetric. This is a very marginal benefit because in our side of the world, you still have things like reviews, right? A simple Google search can show you which book is the most popular right now. We do not think you need advanced technology like BookScan in order to tell you that you need to read a book. They try to frame their world as if in our side of the world, readers have to read every single book before they find one that they really like, right? We think BookScan makes it extremely worse for them. We think things like Google searches, reviews exist in either way. So this benefit is harshly symmetric. They tell you that stories by Black authors or local leaders will get less exposure. in our side of the world. We completely flip this. Robaya already tells you how minority authors are better off in our side of the world. I will expound about it later in the later parts of my speech. Their solution to the minority problem is that minority authors should get to publish books to their respective local communities. We cannot allow this to happen because this just reinforces the echo chamber within those communities. The very point of you writing your story as a Black lesbian is to have your story be heard by white people, be heard by Asian people, and be heard by everybody else that is not within your community. So when they come up and tell us that you would rather continue to let it be sold to niche markets, we think that is incredibly counterproductive, and our side of the world is the only place where minority communities do not face these sorts of roadblocks. I will expand upon this later, right? Look at every benefit that opening government gives you are benefits that you get in our side of the world anyway, right? Things like reviews, things like saving time. We are every benefit that they give you already exists because there is already a way of discerning what book is better than the other in our side of the world. What we prevent, however, is prevent the creation of a classist system where you basically create tiers of elite authors versus authors who do not have a good enough ranking, who do not have the enough number of points to get published by authors. All you get is discrimination by I'll take it later, by publishing authors, right? Okay. Then DPM comes up and tells you that competition is symmetric. This is wrong on so many levels. We think competition is worse off in your side of the world because what you have essentially created is a class system for the popularity of authors. This means publishing house is going to be favoring an author who has 10 points rather than an author who has 2 points but has the potential to write the next one-hit wonder, right? So in their side of the world, these publishers don't have an incentive to even look at or cater to authors that are up and coming, right? To authors that want themselves to be published in this world. So we think competition and the monopolization of authors and one particular set of books is worse off in their side of the world because you have basically created a point system for books, and we don't think media works that way. We think media is inherently subjective. You cannot predict the next book that is going to be the next wonder, right? In their side of the world, you destroy any sort of avenue that you would rather have for hidden gems to be published. Before I move on to fulfilling the burdens, I'll take that POI.
Okay, without BookScan, we think authors with resources and power could more easily use money to promote their book on social media, for example, by the advertisements and Google search. So actually, we think that actually have no mechanism to help those authors with exposure.
We're not gonna oppose the idea of selling your book by advertising yourself, by marketing yourself. We think this is a lot more organic than allowing a class system to develop, to allowing arbitrary measures of previous sales of things like nepotism, etc. to exist. We think advertisement is completely fine. A very important metric of this debate, profit for authors. In which side of the world does profit increase? OG tries to touch on the subject, but they don't really analyze it much further. We think money is an issue on both sides, right? The number of books sold and the number of revenue collected is going to be same in both sides of the world because publishing house wants money and authors wants money. What matters is what type of books are being sold and which author is the money going to. In their side of the world, the authors that are already published, the authors that are already established are the ones whose books are being sold the most, right? In our side of the world, if you are an uprising author, if you're an author of a minority community, you're probably going to get disenfranchised worse and worse. In our side, the distribution is better because underappreciated authors in their world have to constantly worry about their credit score, which disincentivizes them to go to publishing houses. And the only way you can get success in their side of the world is to increase profits, and you cannot increase profits until you get a higher credit score. Second metric, the minority authors. In which side of the world are authors that come from Black communities, LGBT communities, or Latinx communities better off? The premise of this argument is that there already exists systematic discrimination, which means that libraries don't want to house books written by these people, publishers don't want to publish books written by these people, schools probably don't want these sorts of books in their libraries, right? Because they don't cater to the broader white audience and the proper sort of marketing isn't done. So BookScan is not an accurate representation of whether or not books by minority authors are profitable because they have already been disenfranchised by the system again and again, right? So when you as a Black lesbian author go to a publisher's house, they're probably going to run this BookScan business emphasis on you, and they will see that your last books haven't been doing well. What they won't see is that you have been facing all these sorts of discrimination, which is the core reason your sales history is so bad. We know for a fact your sales history is low because of ingrained systematic oppression. So it is harder for minority authors to get their book published in their side of the world, right? Why are minority voices important? Because these people come from very vulnerable communities. They don't usually get their voices heard. They don't usually get exposure any other sort of way. Things like media, things like books, TVs, movies are an incredibly important pipeline for them to get mainstream media attention. When books contain very personal narratives, and you have less microaggressions, more awareness, and you encourage more minorities. We think art is crucial. It is transformative. It educates people, right? In our worst case scenario, sure, you may lose out on the opportunity of not being able to predict whether or not your book will do good, but we still think this risk is worth taking. It opens up avenues for you to propel your career forward. It opens up avenues for you to create the next one-hit wonder and use trial and error. And I'm in protected time. This preserves qualities of books because now you are not chasing clickbaity titles. Now you are not thinking of how to get the most number of how to catch the attention of most readers. What you're focused on, what you're passionate about, is the quality of your writing. You're not chasing a credit score. You're not chasing a rank. For all these reasons, very proud to oppose.
Thank you very much. That's the leader of the discussion. That brings us to the end of the opening house of the debate. I invite the member of government to open the closing house of the debate for the house. Thank you.
Please, am I audible?
You're audible.
I'll check your DM.
Okay. Okay. Yeah, sure. Thank you. So I'll take verbal POIs and I'll be taking them in my 5th minute. So in my 5th minute, you can just unmute yourself. Please, no bad join. Just unmute yourself and then ask gently. Okay, so first things first, let's tackle OO. So OO's biggest case is one, the idea of barrier of entry for new authors. And then in the world where we use a credit system, this barrier of entry or this market is basically shut. And then so we're not able to get impact. We do agree with them that this debate is about minority authors because majority authors will still have their issues published anyway. But then I'm going to prove to you how in their so-called world without the book data scan, this particularly does not happen. What do you need to hear from us? Panel, we think that one, basically readers always get bored and then they want to hear new stuff. Secondly, we think that publishers are able to gain more from new authors rather than old authors because for J.K. Rowling, she's already popular. She can negotiate with you. If the pricing is too high for her, she just moves to another author who wants to do this. We think that then again, it means that people who are famous are not going to be the ones who are going to be very beneficiary to publishers. It then looks like authors or publishers will still want to take their risk to publish new books and then to publish new things at the end of the day, because honestly, that is where you have to get, or that is where you get the best incentive or the best profit at the end of the day. Another thing they fail to realize is that without the book data scan, publishers still need to make decisions because it's not every book that you will publish. You need to realize that the profitability rate of these people means that at the end of the day, they have to choose what is going to make profit for them. Why is the book data scan now the best way to go? Because in the absence of these book data scan, publishers still need to make decisions. These decisions now will be left to be made on publishers' individual preferences. This looks like they are now going to consider things like whether they like the author or not, whether the person's book is based on some ascriptive characteristics like considering the person's race, considering the person's gender, considering the person's social condition as a means of assessing their work. That particularly is very problematic because the thing is that when you leave these things for these individuals to assume, for these individuals to use this kind of means to assess the work, then that is where they lose. Panel notes that the weighting extension is in the comparative, where we're able to point out to you that in the absence of book data scan, these authors or these publishers are now going to use this kind of ascriptive characteristics to now assess people's work, which is far more problematic and then far more classist in the world of OO than they want to preach to you. Impact. Now we think that minority authors will mostly be the ones who are going to be sidelined at the end of the day because one, publishers are going to feel like their issues are not going to appeal to majority anyway, so they'd rather not go with it because they are minority. Once again, it links back to them being assessed based on their conditioning, race, gender, and then social conditioning. Why do we think this is bad, particularly for minorities? Because in Wales or in places that minorities have been constantly entrenched, we need minorities to be able to tell their story very well. In a world where we have book data scan, it's a world where we have data that we can refer to these kinds of data to be able to make sure or to be able to ensure that these publishers are doing the right thing. In their world, there's a clump up of biasness, and then there is no way you're able to go to seek accountability, because at the end of the day, when you go, the publishers just didn't like your book. The publishers didn't think your book would be a hit, etc. We think that all these things makes it largely problematic. But then again, I'm already telling you the kind of incentives that exist to co-opt for new authors, since it's the biggest case or is the biggest idea they need to, the biggest thing that they are concerned with. The situation does not get any better in their world, because in their world, there are no metrics to show which book will be a hit or not. It means that at the end of the day, that kind of selection is still going to have to take place. It means that they do not show us any incentives now for these publishers to not go for these majority groups, for these publishers to not sideline these kind of minority groups, especially when they get to escape that accountability that probably or basically comes with the book data scan. What is the kind of accountability that we get in our world? This is the kind of accountability. We think that in our world, that discrimination, even though they can argue that it can still happen, it is going to be largely minimal in our world. Why? Because one, the data is available. The data is available for everyone to see, to ensure that like the person has the correct score, but you are simply deciding not to go ahead to publish this book. This looks like authors can now co-opt for public support when these discriminations are being done against them. It means that there is a world, there's accountability where we're able to call out these publishers to be able to form a policy over system where correction mechanisms are rather enforced by public and then majority, public and then minority view. In their world, it's just a clamp up. We do not get one, transparency. Two, we do not get any form of accountability. And then three, we do not get any form of utility. Before I move on to my next extension, any POI?
Yeah, closing.
Yeah, closing shoot.
Yeah, so the info slide says that you will be focusing on the profitability, and the premise of your argument is that the minority artists have previous work that was able to be monetarily successful. How do you actually guarantee that?
Okay, so panel, the point is that, or the argumentation are in two folds. Before I get to the POI, he just asked, this is what I'm trying to say, that minority artists that are not successful now do not get that particular buy-ins because of the increased sideline decisions in our world, which I've already showed you that it is going to be motivated more in their world. The second thing now then is to say that some minority artists are already successful, and then the profitability of it, and then let's engage that particular argumentation. We think that publishers as a whole are not people who are of charity. They do not give charity. So at the end of the day, they are still going to be able to make sure that they get amount of profit from the books they made and from the books that they published. I've already shown you how in our world there is an incentive or higher incentive to co-opt for new artists, since profitability is higher there as compared to negotiating with artists who are already profitable, who can take their work to anywhere, and then people are going to benefit there. We think that for publishing companies to be able to make maximum profit, to enjoy good profit, we think that co-option for new authors are very important in today's debate. What does this look like for advocacy groups right now? We think that if advocacy groups, particularly in today's debate, can now represent their people very well, can now exist to be able to call out these biases. Once again, the comparative looks like, before that, last chance. Opening opposition. Okay, so but basically back to what it means for advocacy groups. It means that advocacy groups now have the fair transparency to be able to now represent the issues of these minority groups. So panel realize that all they say about the classism and then the minority groups being trying to protect them, without showing us one, the metric of accountability that we call these publishers to, and then two, the kind of transparency and then incentives that these publishers need to be able to co-opt for these minority groups, basically do not exist. It means that mechanization that is supposed to actualize the kind of argumentation that you get from opposition has been clamped down, because we do not get anything from them. what do you get from my speech? First thing we tell you is that in the absence of book data scan, you leave publishers to make decisions based on ascriptive characteristics. We've already shown you how these ascriptive characteristics are very detrimental to people of minority groups. We think that a world where we have an accountability metric such as the book data scan is a world where increases accountability and then transparency, because authors and then even public, just readers, can even go there and then make sure or ensure that things are not happening the way they're supposed to do. It means that the incentive or the incentive or the tendencies to call out these kind of artists for these issues are higher in our world. And I'll be able to show you how we get more profitability, how minority exclusion is very bad, and then how at the end of the day we get the most important thing, the cooperative corrective policies that benefits everyone. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Ganda. We now invite the member of the system to open the debate of the session.
All right, hi, am I visible and audible? Can everyone see and hear me?
You're audible.
All right, great. So I prefer having my POIs offered in the chat. Please don't unmute yourself. Please type the POI in the chat and I'll get to you at some point. I will make sure to take at least one. I will try to take two if I have time, but I cannot guarantee that I'll take two. But I will make sure that I at least take one. But that's only if I see a POI offered. If there aren't any POIs offered, I'm not going to ask for one. So please just leave it in the chat. I'll get to you. Right, starting my speech in 3, 2, 1. On closing opposition, we think that the issue with BookScan is that it essentially is a blanket numerical figure that does not take into account the various complexities that are involved with the popularity and the success of literature and artwork. And we would argue that it is far preferable that we do not have this blanket numerical feature, because we are far better able to evaluate the various different nuances of what literature and how it is likely to be beneficial on our side of the house. 3 extensions with relation to that, rebuttal being integrated throughout. First, the extension I want to talk about substantively is that this increases the entry barrier into writing and into publication in a way that is particularly harmful and harms diversity. The first thing I would say here is that the fact that publications look for the BookScan score creates a significant entry barrier, especially for new authors who oftentimes do not have a BookScan score at all, because they oftentimes don't have any publications to begin with, which oftentimes forces a greater experience of disappointment. Opening opposition here stops just saying that like they don't have these figures and therefore they're likely to be disadvantaged. But we would extend here on closing opposition is that oftentimes this experience is likely to be particularly traumatizing in a way that discourages these people from ever entering that market. Because the point at which you evaluate these people by a BookScan score, it isn't just that like one publication is likely to reject you because you don't have a BookScan score. That's likely to be the same for literally every single publication that you go to, where oftentimes you're likely to knock the door of one publication, be declined because you don't have a BookScan score, even without reading your manuscript. Go to the next one, have that same experience repeated. Go to the next one, have that same experience repeated, and have the constant experience of being declined to have your manuscript even being read, and have your work ever having the possibility of being published in that situation. Closing government says that the alternative on our side of the house is where each publisher has a different taste, and that's harmful. I don't think that that's harmful. I think that that's actually really good, because that means that insofar as you are a new author and you've written a piece of work and you want to have that published, you can have faith in the idea that maybe the next publisher that reads your manuscript is likely to have a taste that aligns with you and therefore is likely to publish your work. And you can have that hope in terms of trying to find a publisher that is willing to publish your work and release your literature out there, that incentivizes these new authors to at least try to make sure that that work is revealed, reviewed, and therefore try to enter that industry, as opposed to a system in which all publishers have the same metric and have the same metric that necessarily denies entry for these new authors, and therefore this experience denies these authors any opportunity to enter that market in the very first place. I think this far more conclusively proves that there are there's very little entry of new authors on our side of the house in comparison to what we get from opening opposition, and therefore conclusively proves that we get far less diversity in that situation. The second thing I'd add to this is that there's just far less opportunities for authors to improve and develop their works on that side of the house. Firstly, the existence of a system that tracks the popularity, the profits, and the performance of every book that each author releases and publishes necessarily discourages authors from releasing more works out into public. And that is true because oftentimes in this, if like for instance, the status quo, an author can just aim to publish a book so that they can see the reactions of the public and their readers, see if their readers like this, see the different reactions of the readers, and look at the reviews, and they can obviously learn from that experience. The difference is that the point at which those things fail on that side of the house, these authors understand that is likely to harm their future prospects as well, because it means that they get a lower BookScan rating, and therefore discourages these people from ever releasing those works to begin with, which oftentimes means that there's just less opportunities for these people to release different books into the public, but also means that there's also less opportunities for these people to develop their works, because there are just less opportunities for those people to receive feedback on their work. This means that we just get less quality of writers as a result of that. The second thing I'd add to this, in addition to this, you also have to note that when releasing a book, you necessarily need to make sure that it is going to have a high BookScan score, and that necessarily discourages any form of experimentation that these authors might be willing to do. So for instance, in the status quo, maybe you as a author want to try a new different writing style, and that you might think would appeal to different writers, or like appeal to different readers, and maybe see the reaction of different readers. But that is impossible in the status on that side of the house, the point at which you understand that experimentation is likely to deviate from what traditionally gets you a high BookScan score, and therefore you're encouraged to follow the same writing style as other writers that have a higher BookScan score, as opposed to experimenting and risking the fall of your BookScan score, which you understand will affect your prospects in the future as well. I think this is essentially crucial. This is especially important because if you think about the ways in which literature develops, it is through different experimentations and different people trying out different styles and to see what works better and what conveys the message better. You get far less of that on that side of the house, and therefore you get far less diversity. I think this is debate winning because I think opening opposition just mentions that you get less writers and you get less diversity. I think we conclusively proved that one, there are far less ability for writers to enter the market in a situation where they're constantly being declined. But two, even when they do enter the market, they're likely to be forced to conform in the same way, and being unable to experiment leads to far less diversity. I think we far better mechanize that through the incentive structures of authors and how that changes on that side of the house. Before I move on to the next point, I'll take opening.
True profitability exists in specific different market segments and genres. So when making comparisons, publishers do not compare a book about African culture written by a Black author with a book talking about sci-fi or Harry Potter, but with that same type of book written by a white author.
Yeah, that's the thing. I'm going to move on to the next point. Because I think the issue is that you guys have a blanket score that literally puts a number on books about African culture and books about economics or books about white culture and whatnot, and you essentially line them up in that same way with that score, as opposed to these people being able to consider different factors. I think that's just better on our side. I'll get to that later as well. But secondly, I think that BookScan just leads to worse decisions about literature, because here's the thing: the issue with BookScan is that it essentially leads to a previous work bias, where necessarily you assume that if the previous work of this one author was successful, if the next work of that author must be successful. And I think that's a problem, because oftentimes you see authors releasing really good books and then the sequel just flops because reviews are terrible and people are just generally agree that that book was terrible, even despite the previous work that author has released. And oftentimes what that means is that oftentimes just evaluating works based on the previous works of an author is largely inaccurate, and the point at which publishers start to choose what books to publish based on what the performance of the previous books were, that necessarily leads to inaccurate decisions about the quality of books, as opposed to simply reading through all these manuscripts and choosing what to publish, right? We think that we get far better decisions made on our side of the house. But secondly, I think I would also just add that this leads to perverse incentive for a lot of authors as well. Because if you are an author with an already high BookScan score, what you need to do to convince publishers isn't to write a good manuscript, it's simply to show the publisher your BookScan score, and then you're through. That necessarily means that there's far less incentives for authors to continue to try to improve their works, because they have a guarantee of getting published and they have a guarantee reader base as a result of that getting published on that side of the house, as opposed to on ours, where these authors constantly have to work in order to get their future works published as well. We get far better literature as a result of those incentives on our side of the house. Finally, on how this leads to less opportunities for less privileged artists, because I think that on that side of the house, you get a vicious cycle. If they understand that in this status quo, a lot of publishing is based on connections, is based on privilege, that is how you get a better BookScan score, because getting your work published and being able to advertise to the public is what increases the profitability of your work, and therefore leads to a BookScan score in the future that again gets your future works published. If people don't have access to that on that side of the house, on that side of the house, they oftentimes don't have access to the BookScan score that they rely on, and therefore their mechanism does not work. It actually perpetuates the very harm that already exists. For all those reasons, closing opposition.
Thank you very much, member of opposition. We invite the whip of government.
Hello, can I be heard?
You're audible.
So let me organize my speech. Okay. If you want to ask a POI, please unmute yourself and ask gently, right? Don't badger. Okay. So I'm going to start my speech in 3, 2, 1. So panel, firstly, let me respond to the POI that was posed by closing opposition, right? We think that our software considers a lot of things, which includes whether or not you are coming from a minority background. So things like, oh, these minorities will be shut out is like largely minimalistic. Or like what happens in their world. The comparative here is that in their world, even if you have a small skill success, you are unable to show it. That's the reason why minorities still suffer in their world, because there's no agency to add credence to those particular skills. So for example, they won't consider figures that come from sharing these in like small communities, right? Or sales from smaller countries like Ghana, where it's hard to trust the agencies down there, right? Our software incorporates all of these kind of things, right? And that's the mechanism that actually increase accessibility in our world, right? What I think that closing opposition and opening opposition are largely not different. I'm going to treat them as the same thing as opposition, right? First, I'm going to show you why Pearl's case is the best in today's debate and why it should win. And secondly, why opposition cannot place in today's debate, right? First thing, on publishing houses, on the whole idea that publishing houses would put a high value on numerical values of the book rather than the manuscript itself, right? See, panel, the question here is, who benefits more? There's this idea coming out of opening opposition that, oh, this in itself is not going to be so beneficial to authors, right? We think that authors and these companies, publishing companies, all benefit on the same scale, right? Because if publishers are able to promote your book, you don't only benefit or get the profit for yourself, you share these profits with these publishers in itself, right? The company here is the agent, right? Whereby these agents are actually promoting these artists. That means that both of them largely benefit. But then secondly, there's a moral responsibility for the beneficiary who in the past has been rewarded to be rewarded more to increase quality standards, right? Because we think that quality standard is measured by consumers' judgment. If they mentally masturbate constantly because of the quality of the manuscript, then there wouldn't be enough reward for the author, right? But then also, it is wrong to assume that reputation doesn't originate from nowhere. It exists in a vacuum as we get from open opposition, right? We think that reputation will only come from experience, right? What you've done in the past. So it is only justified to keep rewarding these people from their past experiences, right? So that whole idea is shut out, right? But then the second big thing you get, especially from the opposition side, is to say that, oh, there is going to be a shutout, like minority artists are going to get shout out of these markets, right? And they are going to be disenfranchised, right? Yes, this isn't true because we just incentivize minority artists to work hard and like improve, right? Even if that's not the case, in their model, minority artists will still suffer anyway because a big publishing company will see no reason. Pearl already analyzes you why they should actually go in and sell a story from a minority group where it will only appeal to a minority of people. They will always go in for the majority, right? But then also they have to provide a counter proposition or model analysis that makes the situation better on their side, which they didn't, right? So you can't say, oh, it is wrong in your side and don't correct it in your word and think you've won. But then also, Pell tells you that this creates an objective metric for publishers to decide fairly on who to publish. Because in their world, this is what you get. Because there's no objective metrics, these publishers are left to make subjective decisions. These decisions include descriptive characteristics that exist, right? We think these things are things that hurt minorities in their world. They don't find any model to actually counter that. In our world, we do this by actually creating an objective system where it actually holds people accountable, these publishing firms accountable. That is to say, if these artists, minority artists are doing well, we get to reward them, right? But then also let us break this whole idea that there only exist publishing firms for the majority, right? We think that there exist publishing firms that's like there are tons of social impacting publishing firms that focuses on telling news stories from new artists, right? Once the story is out, right? So what this means is that there are lots of publishing companies that also prioritize telling news stories, right? These artists, these publishers normally focus on like progressive groups, right? So there will always be a publishing company that will be focused on telling Black stories, right? What this means as an impact is that no matter what, these people are still going to enter the market in itself, right? We think that closing the exceptional cases are important. Artists' intent and publishers is equal to profitability and popularity for the brand promotion, right? New artists are no different from old artists with new publication. Why? Because like their profitability index may assume that the success of the publication will depend on whether you're a majority or minority. No, our model actually eliminates all those kind of things by taking a lot of things into consideration, right? The BookScan necessarily doesn't give advantage to old artists, right? It rather promotes hard work on both ends, right? So for example, if a publishing company that focuses on making sure that these social small minority group stories are being told actually publishes a story of a minority author, right? And it becomes an instant hit. That means that the person gets that huge credit that you're actually like looking for, right? What that means is that they have been able to penetrate this particular market.
Right.
Then it like clashes out the whole idea that these people are never going to enter these markets in and out of itself, right? Why do we think we went into this debate, right? So
Or six.
first thing, yeah, let me take you before I move on to why we went.
Yeah, if these decisions are made based on these scores, how does an author that is new and therefore doesn't have a score to begin with penetrate into the market?
See,
when
like I've already closed this. I've told you that a lot of publishers exist to actually cater for these excesses that exist, like social movements, like publishers, right? They actually exist to tell news stories. There are lots of publishers that exist for that sole purpose, right? If they're able to publish you and you become an instant hit, you get these credits, right? That means that you don't get shut out of these markets, right? Why should Pearl win today's debate, right? First of all, like she tells you that generally the reason credit systems exist and are good is because they help inform us make better choices, right? A concession in the debate should be the book publishers are businesses, and so like profitability is something that they check in status quo, and their reputation, right? They don't want to publish a book and their reputation gets hurt, right? But then also understand that some publishers also exist to actually tell news stories, as I've already showed you in today's debate, right? So the whole idea of minority groups getting shut out wouldn't actually exist. But in our world, we create better accountability mechanisms. How? Because now these systems are objective rather than the subjective nature of picking out these artists that exist in their world, right? They should show us how they actually cater for minorities in their world, right? You don't get that particularly in their world, right? Our world is one that actually eliminates ascriptive characteristics when actually publishing, right? We think that our world is better because you get more accountability mechanism and you increase accessibility. Proud to propose.
Thank you very much, Dr. We now invite the head for participants.
Hi, am I audible and visible?
You are both audible.
All right, thanks. POIs in the chat. I get distracted when you verbalize your POI, so please just put them in the chat, but I'll make sure to take one before 6. All right. It is very interesting to see government bench that wants to defend for minorities' right when the motion requires them to defend for profitability, especially for the previous work. So the assumption that you get from this government bench as a whole is that when the ability for authors to publish their work is determined based on the previous works and the profitability of the books that were previously published, then automatically the minority authors will be able to prop up. The one link that was never proven is why the minority authors are more likely to have the previous work that has been successful and why they are able to therefore infiltrate into the market, especially if it is true that they also want new authors to continuously influx into the literary realm. They never really proved as to why these people in particular, who do not even have those credits to begin with, will be able to have that comparative edge in that competitive market in the first place. Insofar as we disprove that particular link from closing opposition, all of the government material falls out of this debate. The first thing that I want to then talk about is this idea of monopoly of literature that you get from these opening government, right? And closing government as well. Because opening government says that, look, only famous authors have disproportionately larger number of chances, right? But if you really look at it, a lot of these famous authors coincidentally are famous not because of their cult of personality, but because of their previous works that were to be successful. That means that if you judge the ability to publish books based on the previous successes, obviously these successful artists will be able to dominate the market. But there are two additional things that Wonbin tells you here. Firstly, people who are in positions of power will be able to buy or consume books the most, right? So if the major consumer for any kind of market is going to be those like, white people or those kind of men who have a lot of buyability in the first place. And to the extent to which if this is true, obviously then the literature will, or the books that you get that has high like selling numbers are going to be those that fulfill the white gaze or, for example, cis gaze to begin with. So I'm really unsure why the profitability is automatically inclusive as opening government and closing government wants you to believe in. Presumably then closing government tries to notch in this convenient characterization that now niche markets are able to get more profit because markets get saturated. They never explain why niche market is automatically profitable or why niche and profitable market is automatically progressive. What I would argue coming from closing opposition is that when the market is niche, but you still want to get profit because you want, then you obviously have the incentive to cater to the niche like privileged like individual states or their interests. And to the extent to which if that is true, I would posit that on their side, racism or sexism would get even more extreme because you constantly want to pander to those readers who are privileged, who are white, who are men, and you want these people to buy your book and pay for your book. And if that is the case, if CG's metric is true, that people will cater to the niche market, they never proved by this niche market is in itself progressive, we would posit that it is much likely that it would be offensive to the minorities. But the second thing that we told you is that people with previous record to begin with are the ones who get more, like disproportionately more opportunity on their side of the house, which is why beginner level authors are likely to be locked out. That literally the motion says previous work. So if you do not have previous work, then obviously you're likely to be locked out. To which they say, hey, but all your harms are not mutually exclusive. Then this debate is about the comparative, right? Because what we told you from closing opposition is that the subjectivity of the publishers means that even if you do not have previously successful works, or even if you are not really famous author, then you still have some level of opportunity on our side of the house, insofar as the publishers see your book or see your manuscript as something that is of a high quality. They think that your your manuscript is something that is good or whatnot, right? So insofar as that is the case, I think that it's better on our side, especially when closing government says then that there are some publishers who want to create new stories or who want to publish new narrative, then obviously those kind of publishers would exist symmetrically on our side. Then they will be able to judge these things based on their subjective desire to put new narrative to the market on their side. Even these publishers who care or who want to release new stories to the market would obviously then consider the previous works and previous successes of these authors. And insofar as that's the case, I'm not sure why these publishers who have an incentive to release new stories would have that symmetric extent or a symmetric incentive to do the same thing even on the world of government. They never proved that from closing government. So if that is the case, that already these progressive publishers exist, they are better on our side of the house, right? But what we told you also is that but also when Deputy Prime Minister tells us about the proximity bias that exists, firstly, this is an assertion to just say that everybody who graduated from Cambridge is white professor. But secondly, I would posit that therefore, a lot of the times, like these platforms also do have diverse forums of authors. So even if there exists some level of proximity bias, I would posit that that doesn't mean that like all of the things are going to be whitewashed. And in fact, I would posit that on your side of the house, like when it is like, again, determined by the previous works and previous successes and profits that you're able to garner, that's when it becomes largely more Eurocentric, which they never even like prove this to why the solvency exists on their side. But there are added reasons why authors would enter the market, which we told you that the closing government does not respond to. The first is, in status quo, people publish books for different purposes. Authors want to maybe express their opinions, or for example, want to see public's reaction by their experience and all of these things. But in government side, you shut out a lot of other incentives for publishers to publish the book. And if that is the case, and the only sole metric that the authors are going to care about is success, which I think that means that shuts out a lot of experiments or like new niche types of things that closing government wants to achieve. I'll take a point from opening now.
There are significant probability within each market as long as your readers are really invested and devoted when you have true representation of them. The problem on your side is such choices are crowded out visibly, like from visible of the reader's attention by the publisher's white bias when we are able to solve that.
Yeah. Your premise is these niche markets are profitable. Niche literally means it's not profitable, yeah? So which means that if we take away the profitability metric, then obviously niche markets are better on our side. I really don't understand your mechanism as to how niche markets are automatically fucking profitable. The second mechanism that we told you is you cannot suspect if your work will be successful, which means that a lot of authors a lot of authors, because like the point is, if your one publication it fails, then that literally screws over the entire career, and that's the reason as to why a lot of people will refrain from opting into the market. But third of all, we told you that like peer pressures would obviously exist. So if the culture that you have on their side is these like new authors getting constantly rejected and constantly not being able to infiltrate into the publisher, is exactly the reason why a lot of people don't like refrain from opting in. And if there's a high entry barrier, obviously a lot of other prospective authors would obviously then shun away as well, which are the problems that we told you. So if this debate were to be about who gets the diverse forms of arts, their side has an overarching metric of profit. We have profit as well as other subjective metrics, which is why on net we have more diverse forms of like literatures or books, and that's why we're proud to propose.
Thank you. Thank you everyone for having a good debate. We'll hear from us. Can the speakers please use the phone?
Andrews, the recording. Are you still going to start with us?
I'm a bit confused. Do we like leave?
Yes.
Yes, please.
Hello guys, has the round ended? And can I stop the recording now?
Yes.
Okay, thank you. Also, judges can deliberate in any of the feedback rooms on Discord. Okay, that's better.
Okay.